So feel free to follow along on your own machines as I'm talking. There are some kind of interactive elements to it, and there's links out to other examples. So what I'm going to talk about today is the Image API. So we alluded to it yesterday in Ben's presentation, and he gave you a quick intro into how the different parts of the Image API work together. And then Jack in the previous session also linked about how different parts of the Image API works. But I'm going to go into a little more depth, first on how the Image API works, and then secondly, how we can use the services that offer the Image API to create our own IIIF Image API services. So just to start off with the learning objectives, I'm hoping at the end of today that you get an understanding of what the Image API provides and how to use it, be able to change the image URL so you can get different parts of an image, understand the different types of the Image AI implementations. I'll mention this briefly, not go into a lot of detail, but there are different types of Image API servers, some which might be more to use case and some which might be more powerful. So I'll talk briefly about those. And then also get some, see some of the tools that work with the Image API. So you'll see with the presentation tomorrow that some of the more advanced tools like Mirador and the Universal Viewer are based on the presentation API and won't work with just the Image API, but we'll see some examples of tools that do. But I'm going to start off with what is the Image API, and really start with some terminology. When I'm talking about an API, it stands for Application Programming Interface, which is a horribly complex acronym, but it basically means there is an agreed standard for the client and the server to know what each other are doing. And so you can have a client knows how to talk to an image server, and the image server knows exactly what the client is going to be able to do. And that's really the basis of all this interoperability. All the different clients know how to talk to all the different Image API servers, which makes this such a powerful tool. The second terminology when I'm talking about a client, so this is the software which allows you to view a IIIF image. So a IIIF image can't by itself be understood by a web browser. So you usually have some sort of JavaScript that lives on a web page, which does the conversion from the Image API to something that you can view on the web. And examples include OpenSeaDragon, the Mirador and Universal Viewer, and I tend to call them clients. Server. So this is software that runs on a machine somewhere and is available at all times and is accessible over the web. So it's slightly different to a local laptop, which you turn off and take home. A server in this context is a machine that is always available and is always online. And the next part is the Image API. So this is the agreed standard. I'll show you it here. So on here, there's an Image API standard, and this gives you all the rules about using the IIIF Image API and all the different features that you can use with the Image API. And this is the thing that both the server and the client agree on that controls their interaction. And I'll give you some highlights of that today. And then the other thing I talk about is the Image API server. And this is the actual bit of software that you install somewhere on a server that provides the Image API. And I'll go through some examples, and we'll use a couple of them in the practical examples. I should say, if you've got any questions, please speak up or put it in the chat and I'll try and look out for them. So to start off with, I'm going to start with a bit of history of how IIIF started. So it really started out the medieval manuscripts community, and you can see with a lot of our early examples, they were very much medieval manuscript focused. But over time, there are a lot more use cases than just manuscripts. There's 3D objects, newspapers, paintings, pictures, a whole variety, but it really started out of the medieval manuscript community. And there's a great blog there from Ben, who talked yesterday about what it was like using the old way of accessing manuscripts compared to IIIF and the benefit that IIIF gives you. But just to give you a personal perspective and also a perspective from an institution who did a lot with digitization and struggled a bit to make their stuff available online. I worked at the National Library of Wales for 13 years, making their content available on the internet. And when I first started, it was 2005, I think, the way we used to do digitization is that we used to digitize a manuscript to the highest quality we could at that time. And we come out with 3 different versions of the image. We'd have a thumbnail, a reference sized image, and an archival TIFF version, which was very high quality, but you could only access it if you requested it from the library and you had a legitimate research use case. And the viewer we used was this one. It was called a MET viewer, and we were able to provide access to the image, and you'd be able to click on this little minus symbol and go to thumbnail. But that was the limit to the interactivity. You could browse by pages, but you couldn't ask for bigger sizes. You couldn't ask for smaller sizes. You couldn't zoom. It was just a very static website. And then as screens got bigger and the internet got faster, it fast proved that these sort of discovery mechanisms wasn't enough for researchers, especially ones that wanted to really analyze the image. You can see the image here, and it was slightly bigger than this in practice, but it was still made it very difficult to work with. And there'd be no chance to run the kind of AI methods that Jack was talking about in the last session. So a lot of institutions moved to a different type of access by providing a zooming service, where you could initially go to a page and you'd see the image, and then you could zoom into the area that you're interested in. And this was kind of a compromise to be able to allow access to the high quality version, but not the archival TIFF. You'd make kind of a derivative, which was faster on the internet and could allow this zooming function. And there were a couple of standards around at that time. One we looked at was Zoomify, but there was also Microsoft had a DZI version, but these were both proprietary file formats. So you'd take your TIFF, you'd convert it into, say, a DZI file or a Zoomify file, and the viewers tended to be Flash, which suddenly was unsupported in modern mobile viewers. And around this time as well, JPEG 2000 came along, and I'm going to talk about that later. But it was seen as a good, relatively open format to use for these sort of zoomable viewers. And then enter IIIF. And the things that it really provided that was different to what was there before was a standard URL structure for accessing images, which makes it easy for us to be able to use and to hack around with. But it really makes it easier for image servers to implement and viewers to be able to consume. And it was a real change to some of the proprietary formats, which were just unreadable really for humans to be able to understand. It provides all the information you need to derive a zooming experience. And a positive was this hackable URLs. So you can see an example here, and Ben mentioned it yesterday. I've simplified the version from the specification slightly to sum up this bit here as the identifier for an object, followed by the region, size, rotation, quality, and format. And I'll go through each one and give a bit more information. But you can see it's kind of a readable URL that we can understand and we can manipulate. And because it's such a predictable URL, it also means that it's very cacheable. So if I were to look at this image and then re-look at it again, say in a couple of minutes, the browser would have already cached it, and so it wouldn't go to the server to get you a new copy. So it means it's a lot faster to access these images, and also means it scales a lot better to many users. So if we first look at the identifier, so in this portion I've highlighted the identifier part of the URL. You can see here that I've put a few in here, and you're welcome to play with this while I'm talking, but you can see if we switch out the identifier, the underlying image will change. And you can see some examples from 3 different institutions there. We've got one from Harvard, we've got the DLCS, which is from Digerati, which is a commercial hosting company and services. And then we've also got an example from the Smithsonian. And you can see how their URLs are slightly different, but they're all in the same sort of form, where it starts with the HTTPS, then it has the host name, and then a path to the image. One thing to highlight is all the examples here I've used are HTTPS, and that's really one important thing to improve the interoperability of your images. HTTPS means that it's a secure protocol, and And if you display, if you're using an HTTPS site, like for this example, we use HTTPS here, I can only display HTTPS images. So that's something to note, that if you want your images to be used, you should try and use HTTPS where possible. I've called this the identifier, and I personally think this is kind of the identifier of the image. This is the full identifier of the image. If you put that in the browser, what you'll get to, it'll forward you onto this info.json. And this info.json gives you all the technical information you need to drive the zooming experience for that image. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but you can see things like the width and the height. And these are the width and the height of the full image, which is hidden behind this IIIF URL. And then there's this profile part here, which tells you exactly what features the Image API server that you're using supports. And you can see them in more detail if you follow the link to the IIIF Image API standard. But one thing to note, that everything to the right of this identifier is what's controlled by the IIIF Image API. So everything after here is predictable. And there are either two options. You can either put this link into an image, or you can get an info.json. And they're the two things that you'll see after this identifier. The next portion of the URL is the region. And this allows you to select a subset or a region of interest of an image. So you can see in this example, we've highlighted the head here. And you can see that the format is X, Y, width, height, with the origin at the top left. So in this example, the X is this value here from the left. And we're saying it starts at 125 pixels from the left and 15 pixels from the top. And then we're going to go to the width and the height, and it says it's 120 pixels wide with 140 high. And you can see what it comes out with. This is the kind of the stuff you'd use in the URL. But in reality, these images are so large that it's very difficult to work out the X, Y, width, height. So most people use these type of cropping tools, which will give you the information for you. So this is an example from Jack Reed, and you can see as you're moving the box around, the region part, which is this 1206, 110, 3020, 1598, that's changing as you're changing the box. And that's much more of a common use case for people trying to get regions. It takes a lot of maths work and guesstimation to try and work it out by hand. And this is another example from the UCD in Dublin. This is a really great tool for picking out regions of an image. So I've selected the head there, and if I scroll down to the bottom, you can see the URL here. It gives you to the URL to the image, and it picks out the region for you. There are also a couple of shortcuts. So if you put full, that means you want the full region of the image. So in this example, you've got the full image. There are also square. This is a bit of an odd one really, but it means that you're asking the image server to return the image as a square. This one is a rectangle, and the spec doesn't say how the server should do it. It just says it should return a square version of the image. And you can see in this example, it chops off the head and legs. So it's not, you know, it can be useful, especially for if you want square thumbnails on the page. This can be useful, and for some images like maps, this is kind of a good summary of what a map might be, but it doesn't work in all cases. So we've seen the full one, which is the full-sized image. We've seen the square. This particular region has been picked out as the head, and this particular region focuses on the book and the hand. And you can see you can jump around the image using this, and it's the same identifier, a different region, and we'll go on to the next ones next. So the next parameter is the size parameter. So again, we have some shortcuts like full, which is the full size image. So if you were to kind of digitize something at high quality, and you'd have this TIFF version, the full size would be the same size as that thing that you scanned. It's the highest quality possible version of your digitized image. not all organizations make their images available at full size, and there are ways to restrict access to the full size and only to smaller versions. But this example in Harvard, they do give you access to the full size. Another option is just to specify the width. So this is an example with, we've just specified that it should be 500 pixels wide. We haven't specified the height, and the image server has worked out if it's 500 pixels wide, to keep the aspect ratio, it needs to be so high. And that's how you can do that. So that's a useful shorthand if you just want to make sure it's 500 pixels wide. You can also do the opposite, where you just specify the height. So for this example, we specified that we just want a height is 250, and we'll let the server work out what the width should be. And just to give you an example, this is the same one the other way around, where the width is 250, but the height is determined by the server. Or you can be very explicit and say, I want it to fit in a 250 by 250 square. And as you can see, it's been distorted, so it does match the square. If you'd rather not distort it, you can put an exclamation mark before the number. And this says, I want it to fit in a box of 250 by 250, but I don't want you to distort it. And what the server's done is it's picked its longest side and made sure that that is 250. And so the top is a lot shorter in this example. I mentioned the full-sized image is restricted in certain institutions. And actually in version 3 of the Image API, we've got rid of full completely and changed it to max. And so now from version 3 onwards, you can use the max keyword in the size, and you'll get the max allowable image, which might be the full, but not necessarily if people have restricted it. And then rotation. So this is pretty self-explanatory in that you can rotate the image. So this is rotated by 45 degrees, by 135. There's one slight extra functionality, is this mirroring. So if you use the exclamation mark before the 0, it will mirror it. So that's looking at 0 with the exclamation mark. And if I take the exclamation mark, you can see it's just flipped it over. Not all servers support rotation. So we talked about this level of compliance, and there are different kind of levels of advancement that each server provides. So level 0 is the most basic server, and it basically means that everything is pre-generated. There's no kind of running code that does the Image API. And so these are always the most basic requirements. And in level 0, you don't support rotation. So you have to put the 0, you won't support any other rotations. Then there's the option to support just 90 degree. This is optional in level 1 and level 2, 2 being the most comprehensive implementation of the Image API. And then arbitrary rotation. So in this example, it does do arbitrary because I can request degrees of rotation, which are different to the 90, 180 and 270. And then finally, the optional of mirroring, which this example does support. And the Harvard example, part of the reason I used it for the demo is that it's a level 2 implementation. So it implements the majority of the optional features of the specification. Next, onto quality. And this might be different to what you're expecting with quality. In this case, quality means the different types of color associated with an image. So the default is whatever the original digitized item, the color it came out with when you scanned it. So you could have scanned it as grayscale, and if you only got grayscale, then that would also be your default. And default's useful in that you always know it'll exist. So if you're putting together an image URL, if you use default, you'll always know it'll return something. But there are other options. So some servers convert color images to grayscale, bitonal, which is exactly black or white, or color. So it could be that if we have a color image, the default would be color, and that would be the same as the color one. Potentially, there are some tools which you can colorize black and white images, and potentially you could return that the color, but we haven't seen a lot of that in practice. And this can be useful for OCR generation and some of the AI applications which aren't so interested in the color, but are interested in processing the image further. And just to loop back to the info.json I mentioned earlier, this profile, which if you click that link, you'll see the profile for this image that we've been using. And you can see under the qualities, it supports default, bitonal, gray, and color. If you have a look at some of the other example images I've sent, some only support default and some support some of the others. But you can see here, so default is the color one. The gray one, which is the grayscale, different colors, a different, it uses white all the way to black, different gradients. And then you've got bitonal, which is very much, it's either black or it's white, because it's very stark image. And then color, which is exactly the same as default. Then finally the format. So again, this is basically, it's relatively simple in it, you just put the extension that you want. And if the image server supports it, it will return it to you. This particular example supports JPEG images, PNG images, TIFF images, GIFs, and WebP type of images. And if we had a look in the info.json again, we'd see which images were supported by the server. So I'm going to pause for questions and just go back to here. Are there any questions you have on the Image API? And John notes he wished he knew about the crop tools, and I take it maybe you've tried to do it by hand and seen how difficult it is. I don't know, John, if you want to unmute yourself and tell us about it. Doing it in Photoshop, okay. I should note that the region here, you see you've got this 1000 by 100 by 3000 by 200. The coordinates are based on the maximum sized image, which makes it even more difficult to do it by hand. Because you might think in this particular image, you could measure from there to there and then kind of work out where it was. But what you're actually working on is the full-sized image. This one. So the region coordinates here are based on the full-size image, which can make it is difficult to work with, which is why, as I say, why we have these crop tools. Okay, so I've got a group exercise for us. So I'm hoping that you're going to unmute yourselves and help me build this URL. So just to recap on what we've done so far, this is another example from NCSU, NC State University in America. And I'm going to take this URL, open a new tab, and I'm going to start here with just the identifier. And the task is, we want a full image, which is 512 pixels wide, is upside down, is grayscale, and has a format of PNG. So I'm going to try and do that here so you can see the questions and the image. Yeah, so hopefully you can see the URL, my address bar, and we can see the questions at the bottom. So Sally, yep, the region is full. So the first one is full. And then the next one is, how do we make it 512 pixels wide? Yep, so 512. Next one, make it upside down. That's right, so rotate it by 180 degrees. And then we want it grayscale. We'll try the exclamation mark 0 and see what it looks like. not quite slash grayscale. That's it, gray. And then how do we get to the .png? That's it. So let's have a look at it. So brilliant. So it's the full region. We haven't just done a little bit of the image. We've done the full image. We've asked for it 512 pixels wide. We've rotated it by 180 degrees to turn it upside down. We've asked for it for gray and a PNG. And there was an option to use the exclamation mark 0. So that's without the exclamation mark, and the exclamation mark will mirror it rather than turn it. I haven't quite got my head around what the different rotations and mirroring will do to the image. So if you want to play play around with it and see what combinations you can do, could you do it with? I don't know what this would do. I mean, it's upside down, but it's reflected. So I don't know whether there's some combination of doing that you get the same image. So great. So we've built up this image. The one thing just to note at this point, that when you're creating these images, the order of doing it is important. So in this particular question, I said, we start with the full image. So we're starting with the region, then we're doing the size, then we're rotating it, and then we're grayscaling it, and then we're doing the format. And that kind of order of implementation is important. In theory, it means that you should be able to get access to every portion of the image, but there might be examples where that order of implementation limits you. But if you do come across them, they're likely to be very rare. So I'm going to move now on to kind of getting started with using IIIF images and the tools and techniques that are available. Are there any questions on the theory of how to use the Image API first? No. Okay. So I'm going to move on to file formats. And this is just a bit of an aside, really, to say that we haven't yet mentioned file formats, or more specifically, we haven't mentioned the file format of the source image. So we saw in the previous example that we could export it as JPEG, PNG, and TIFF, but we haven't made any mention of what the source format is. So this is a format that you've digitized, it's come out of your digitization processes, and you've got an image or images off the web that you'd like to use with IIIF. And the main reason for that is that IIIF is agnostic to the source image file format. The IIIF standard doesn't say you must use TIFF or JPEG 2000. It says you can use any type of source image. So the decision on what source image type to use is more related to the image server, which we're going to go on to, and what they support. And almost all of them support JPEG, PNGs, TIFFs, or GIFs, the kind of main common image formats. But to get the fastest experience, you should be using a tiled image format. And the two I've listed here are JPEG 2000 and a special kind of TIFF file called a pyramid TIFF. And what I mean by a tiled image format, you can see this example of the Mona Lisa. And the red squares are somebody zooming in from a thumbnail, zooming into the whole image, and then zooming into the face, and then zooming into the face in more detail. And you can see there are 4 different levels of zoom here. And as you're zooming, you're seeing less and less of the full image. And this is one of the things that makes IIIF and some of the zooming technologies really fast and efficient. So if you imagine this bottom image is really a large TIFF, a high quality TIFF, the user is only getting copies of the image that they're actually viewing. And so all of these other images, which are outside of your particular viewport, they're not being sent to your machine. And so it makes it a very fast experience. And you only see the part of the images which you're interested in. And IIIF can be used to address each of these different little squares on the image. So there's a way you can construct the URL, as you saw with region and size and rotation and things, to get access to each of these individual squares. And these individual squares are called tiles, and you can combine these tiles to make up an image. Now, the way JPEG 2000 and a pyramid TIFF works is it pre-generates all of these different tiles and all of these different levels and stores them inside the JPEG 2000 or the pyramid TIFF. So that means when an image server requests this particular tile, it doesn't need to decode the massive TIFF. It can go straight into the JPEG 2000 and pick out the tile and send it back to the image, just send it back to the user. So if you want to make access to high quality images, you'll see a lot better experience if you use JPEG 2000 or this special kind of TIFF, a pyramid TIFF. And a pyramid TIFF is a special kind of TIFF. It's not something that will generally come out of a digitization process. It's usually something if you were going to use pyramid TIFFs, you get the TIFF and then you convert it from a normal TIFF to a pyramid TIFF. It's a slightly unusual format. If you were to use, say, a straight PNG for this larger image, you're basically asking the image server to do the processing on the fly, to download the full image to the image server and then pick out the bit that you're interested in and throw away the bit you're not. So it's less efficient and takes up more processing and will generally be slower. So although IIIF doesn't mandate you having a particular image format, the vast majority of people use JPEG 2000 or pyramid TIFF, and this is the reason. Are there any questions? Okay, so I'm going to just talk about here about what the uses of the Image API are. So we've been through how it works, and now I'm going to talk about what you can use with the Image API. So the first example is I showed you how to hack a URL, and this example is that same one we've been working with, and you can embed them in web pages. You can tweet them on Twitter, because it's a full path and it ends in a .jpeg or .png. You can treat it like any other image on the web, and this is kind of a small feature of the Image API, but is incredibly useful, especially for web development, for writing blogs, for any other reason that you want to take a high quality image, but you want to kind of focus on a little bit of it. You can kind of unpick the URL to get the bit you need. In the age of coronavirus and having to do home teaching, this is an example that I've used in my children's work, using a menu from the Smithsonian and using the UCD cropping tool to just crop out the bits of the menu that I wanted, and then using it as a background in a PowerPoint. And I think the task was to write a menu. And actually, the Smithsonian, I'm yet to find a teaching project which I haven't found a resource in the Smithsonian collection. They've got so many great material in there for lots of different uses. And then finally, the most common use case is this zooming use case. So all of that Image API in the background is there to be able to deliver this zooming experience. If I open up my web developer toolbar. So there are some kind of hidden features in Firefox and browsers which will show you what the browser is requesting as you're looking at a page. And so on the right hand side here, I've got the list of URLs that are being requested. So you can see the menu example is there. And as I kind of start zooming through the image, you can see the IIIF URLs coming past. So you can see there. As I was using this viewer, it was requesting IIIF URLs in the background, and you can see we've got the identifier again, we've got the region, we've got the size, which is 1024 pixels wide, no rotation, and the default quality in the JPEG. I think if I hover over it, you can see the actual tile that's requested. So this particular viewer is called OpenSeaDragon, and it works directly with the Image API. With a more complicated universal viewer and Mirador, which we'll see more tomorrow to do with the presentation API, this OpenSeaDragon is embedded in those viewers. So this does all the kind of the zooming, and it does some really clever things by getting the different tiles in the background. So it makes this really smooth zooming experience as you go around a IIIF image. Next, I want to just show you the National Museum Sweden. So this is an example of an institution which has implemented the Image API, but hasn't implemented the Presentation API. And I just wanted to show you what was possible, even if you only get this far. So you can see what they've done is they've embedded this OpenSeaDragon viewer into their content management system for their website. And you can see that if I zoom in. Yeah. That's not working quite as well as it was earlier, but you can see that it's a zoomable URL. It uses the OpenSeaDragon. And if you look down here, the way they've got around kind of the features of the presentation API is that they've embedded it in their content management system, and the metadata and relatedness of the material is always all done in the CMS rather than the IIIF. So it's perfectly useful like this, but some of the things that you miss is they can't really have that IIIF logo that Ben showed you yesterday. Because they only implement the Image API, it's difficult to take this image and open it somewhere else because it's just a bit too low a level. If you want that kind of sharing and being able to take content from one collection to another, you need to implement the Presentation API on top of the Image API. But that being said, there are some examples which do work with the Image API, and this one is a really powerful one. Called Georeferencer from Clocan. You can just drop in a IIIF image URL into here. And it'll give you an interface. This is a good one here. So it shows you the modern map, and it's mainly for georeferencing historical maps. And you can put points on the old map and the modern map, and it'll warp the old map so it'll fit on top of the new map. Which makes maps much more easily discoverable if you can kind of relate them to geographical coordinates in the modern day. And that works just with the Image API. So before I start getting onto the getting started bit, are there any more questions? So with this bit, we're actually going to start using an Image API, putting our images into an Image API service and seeing what it can do. I'm going to start with a bit of theory about different ways to do this, because there are many different options. And then on the left-hand side, you can see 3 different tasks. The first one, hosted Internet Archive, if you can try and get that done before tomorrow, because Mike will use the output of that in the presentation API section. The cantaloupe and static images I'll go through. They're more advanced and more specific for different use cases, which I'll also cover. Don't feel you need to go through these. These are just for extra credit, I suppose, and extra information if you want to dive deeper into it. But if you're going to do one thing, please just do the hosted Internet Archive version. Okay, so if you want to be able to do the Image API, I mentioned at the very start that in some ways it's the easiest one to get started with, because there are just off-the-shelf servers or services which you can choose to be able to use the Image API. But they all have different benefits and complications, and so the choice for you will be quite different. We ran a survey in 2018 asking what people were using to do the Image API. There were 30 responses, and just to also make clear that it was mostly from kind of experienced IIIF members of the community that answered it. So it wouldn't be, we'd probably get a better, different result if we sent it out to people at large. But hopefully it's informative. But you can see some people are using hosted commercial companies, but the vast majority of people are using the image servers, which I'll talk about later. IIIF Image was the most popular at that time with 11, Loris, and then this one here is Cantaloupe, the 4 one. And then some people are using their own in-house developed systems. Sorry if you can hear the chickens. Probably the easiest way. So I've tried to do this in 2 ways. I think there are 2 groups of people in the workshop. There are groups of people which come from institutions, which may be looking at installing IIIF in their institution. And then I think we've got the other side of kind of researchers and people looking to use IIIF material. And maybe they have images which they want to make IIIF available, but they wouldn't necessarily have an IT infrastructure which they can use. So I'm trying to cover both bases here. And from an institution perspective, probably the easiest way to get started, if you're able, is to use one of the existing vendor or DAM systems that you might have in your institution. So we're seeing a lot of companies implement IIIF, and the more that can, I think, will be better for everybody. But there are examples we've seen: Content DM implement IIIF, Gallery Systems, which is Gallery Systems and Next, and Resource Space, which are mainly museum systems. Rosetta, which is kind of a long-term preservation repository. Viridian, which specialize in newspapers, and they've taken the Image API and they've implemented it in their systems. And the reason that this might be the best option for some is that you only have 1 copy of your image. You don't need to store a copy in your DAMs or your other system. There's a question about DAMs, and yes, sorry, I should have explained this. So DAMS stands for Digital Asset Management System, and is the place where you store your images. It's more popular, I think, in museums to call it DAMs, but I know some libraries also call them DAMs, or they might be known as repositories. But they're systems that are there to store and manage your images. A lot of them in the past have just been there to store images, but now they're looking more at providing access to images. And one way of doing that is through IIIF. So if you do have some sort of system, it could be called a content management system or some system for managing your images. If you can make that IIIF accessible, then it saves you a lot of work. But I'll go on to the other options because these things aren't always possible. But if you're wondering if you have one of these systems, probably the best question to ask is, where do you store your images at the moment? Where do you get them from? And if it's a system within your institution, is it something that could be made accessible by IIIF if it isn't already? The second option is hosted. So this means you're usually paying for a service. So there are a couple of commercial companies here, Clocan with IIIF hosting, and Digerati with their DCLS platform. And the idea with this is that you upload your images and then you pay them a fee to store them for you and to run the image server on your behalf. So particularly Clocan is really easy to use, and there's a guide there from another workshop if you want to have a go at uploading images. They allow 5 free images for free, and it also has to be under 100 megabytes. So they're the 2 kind of restrictions, but you can have a play with them. They also have a very upfront costing, and you can see the pricing there. I know some people find this an expensive option, but in some ways you've got to compare it to the resources of installing and maintaining things yourselves. But it is an option, especially if you've got a small amount of images. This kind of hosting option is definitely something to look at. But for this particular workshop, we're going to use something from the Internet Archive that Ben pointed me to. And this is great because it's free, and I'll quickly go through that in the next stage. but it means that you can upload your images and then it'll produce a IIIF Image API endpoint, which we can use in the demonstration tomorrow. If hosted isn't going to work for you, then the other option is to use a IIIF image server. And there's a list there, and they are, I think all of the ones there are open source and free to use, but free to use as in you have to install and maintain them yourselves. So there is a workshop here on the Cantaloupe, which is one of the image servers, and you're welcome to follow that to see how it works and see what's involved in installing one of these servers. I mentioned the main ones was IIIF Image, Loris, and Cantaloupe. Functionally, they're very similar. They offer very similar services. There are often discussions in the community about which one is faster, but I don't think there's a lot in it between the three of them. The major difference in them is the different way what languages they're written in. So IIIF Image is written in C, Loris is in Python, and Cantaloupe is in Java. And so some institutions have a preference for a particular language when they're using different pieces of software. And that's been the main driver about why people are choosing to use IIIF Image over Cantaloupe, say. And then the final option is static tiles. So I mentioned this concept of a level 0 image. So up until now, we've been using dynamic image APIs where you can use that UCD cropping tool to just pick out a particular region of an image. With the level 0, everything is pre-generated. So all of the different tiles are just stored in a directory. And you can see this example here, full. And I'll look in a minute at GitHub, and you'll see that if I go to page 002, there's a directory called full. In that directory, there's a folder called 212, comma. In there, there's a directory called 0, and in there's a file called default.jpg. So this level 0 is the kind of the most basic function of IIIF that can be done in an easier and cheaper way, and there's a workshop on this. But if you see this example, which this thumbnail, it only has a limited number of regions, but it still allows the zooming experience. So there are some advantages to this, mainly around cost. The difference in cost between an image API server and a static tiles is quite substantial. And this is a lot cheaper method of doing it. And there's an example in here, the Static Images Advanced workshop, which gives you a guide to use these images and upload them to GitHub pages, which is a free method of providing access to generally to websites, but also to these level 0 IIIF images. And there are also paid versions of this web hosting, for example, Amazon S3. So there's a question about, do different image servers have different approaches to AV material? If they can, each do it. So that's a really good question, and I should have explained this, but audio-visual material don't need to be in a image API service. So when we talk about the presentation API tomorrow, we'll see examples of how the presentation links to the image API. But for AV material, it doesn't need to have a server. You can just point to an AV resource, either on YouTube or just on a file system somewhere. It doesn't need the same sort of service. There was a huge discussion when we first started looking at audiovisual about whether we should create this IIIF AV service and make it kind of a similar URL structure for AV material. And after long discussions, it was decided we wouldn't do that because a lot of the things that we wanted to do are available through either JavaScript or through the way the web works. And so we didn't want to implement something specifically for AV. So there isn't an equivalent AV service for images. Now to complicate things, I think Cantaloupe has support for AV, but I don't know what it does. And whenever I've worked with AV material and IIIF, I've not used an image service. Does that make sense? Great. So what I'll do is we've got not a huge amount of time left. So I'll just go through these 3 tasks and try and set you up. And then if you can, get started once we finish the call, and I'll be around on Slack if you have any questions. There's a couple of questions here. Do images really not care how you organize your images? No. So if I can go back to here, particularly the identifier. So you can see this in this example, we've got this URL here, and then we've got IDs, and then we've got IIIF, and then we've got this identifier. So in the Harvard example, they have, I think it's a big repository of digital objects, so images and videos, and they're all accessible by this unique identifier here, 252.86607. So they've built this URL that if you ask for this image, they know how to do the routing in the background to get to that particular image. When we use cantaloupe, and you can see this in the example, we're just going to give it a directory, and you just put as many images as you want in there. If you want to organize your images into different directories, you can, and it just changes the identifier here. So the image server doesn't care how they're organized. The way you kind of make sense of these massive images is through the presentation API, which we'll cover tomorrow. Question is, what if Cantaloupe is installed in an Islandora digital library, but the image is a TIFF? Can I use this for this workshop? Yes, so if you already have access to an image server, you can use those image server identifiers in tomorrow's workshop. But it may well be useful having a look at the hosted one, just as a kind of alternative. So you've got one in case that causes you any problems. But you should be able to use that one in the one tomorrow. I'll just quickly go through these ones as we're running short of time. For the hosted, this is using the Internet Archive, and the process that I'd like you to follow is to register for account on the archive.org website, upload your image. When you do so, you get to this type of file, this type of page. So this is an image I uploaded yesterday. And you can see at the end, I've got this identifier, image 8664, and that's something that the Internet Archive gave me. And then you can use that on this URL to get access to the IIIF image. Yes, it is Victoria. And then there's some more step-by-step guides. So the basic steps are these 5 steps, but you can go through here the step-by-steps, see the different screenshots of the process, all the way from login, all the way to upload, and then to access the Image API. And then on step 5, I've created some links here for you to be able to test your Image API. So if you go to this one, you'll have to change this URL to the URL that you get back from the Internet Archive, but this should give you access to a zoomable viewer, and this is just to double check that your image is working well. And then also you can put it into the UCD cropping tool. Some of the archive images can be a bit slower than some of I've seen, but if you wait, it should load, and then you can see you can go around and crop things. Excuse me. The next option is this cantaloupe, and again, this is completely optional. Thinking about this more, this would be more suitable for those that are interested in setting up IIIF in their institution. If you're only looking to host a few images or are more interested in the kind of research uses of IIIF, this may be overkill to set up your own image server. But if you're interested in the process, the full instructions are here. It does require some command line running of programs, But if you do get any problems, just reach out in Slack and I'm happy to give you a hand with it. And then finally, generating static tiles. So this is how you can do the level 0 implementation. So if you've done the Internet Archive, this might be one to look at. It's potentially a very cheap and scalable way of doing IIIF, but there are a lot of steps, so it's not the easiest one to do, but it has some real advantages, so I've put it in here. The restriction I mentioned on level 0 is that you can't ask for custom regions. You can only ask for the things that have been pre-generated, and you can't ask for things that are outside of that. It's mainly, I put here, it's mainly useful for kind of small scale, but there are examples like this Code for Lib journal article, which have set up processes for using level 0 images for thousands of images. So it does scale. The general overview of this is installing Java as you did for the cantaloupe one, downloading something called a IIIF tiler, which will take your image and cut it up into the tiles. And this will create a directory of tiling little images, the tiles, and then you can make it available using this Chrome web service, so Chrome web server, which we'll also be using tomorrow for the presentation API. And then the final step is making sure it works properly, but pushing your image which you've created locally onto the internet. And the method here is is with GitHub pages, and you can see it's a pretty convoluted process, but at the end you have you can see the example here which I showed earlier, which allows you to do that kind of zooming of this static image. So we've got minutes left. Are there any questions? So question, I don't think it's a silly question about do these images upload to the Internet Archive become publicly accessible? I believe they do. It's the first time I've used it, so I'm not 100% sure. Ben says yes, they do. Thanks, Ben. There is an option when I found that you can say it's a test item, and it will be removed 30 days after you've done it, which is quite useful. But yes, it will be public. If you're after a more private place to put it, we do have this this Clocan workshop, which is using that commercial company to host IIIF images, and that will be as private. The image will be accessible everywhere, but unless you know the identifier of the image, it's unlikely that it will be found. So are there any questions? Should we be using images we created? It's up to you. You can just have a look on the internet for interesting images, or you can use images that are from your collections or that you have access to or that you're interested to. It doesn't really matter that much. I would try and pick images that are relatively big, just because they work better in some of the viewers. So you generally go to the Internet Archive to use free-to-use images. That's a really good point. So if you do find one, I mean, it'd be useful just to get experience of how the upload process works in case you need to use it in the future. But I don't think there's anything stopping you using another Internet Archive image and maybe going through this process and seeing how it works. Okay, well, I'll leave it there, and do feel free to reach out on Slack if you have any questions, and let me know how it goes. Thank you all. Sorry, one final question. Should we just use images or also digitize books? Either or. I think potentially with the presentation API tomorrow, which is going to work with multiple images, it might be nice to do it as a book, but it won't matter too much if you just do individual photographs or something else.